Welcome to a conversation with Brooke Siem, author of May Cause Side Effects, a memoir that started 6 years ago with antidepressant withdrawal and led to a journey of self-discovery. The book and her vigorous advocacy of it is a landmark, unprecedented, patient-led effort to change medicine. I'm Adele Framer. Many of you know me as Alto Strata, founder of survivingantidepressants.org, which since 2011 has provided peer support for tapering psychiatric drugs and withdrawal. Our producer, Nicole Lamberson, is also a veteran of protracted psychiatric drug withdrawal. You may know her from her work with the Benzodiazepine Information Coalition, the Benzodiazepine Action Work Group of the Colorado Consortium, Inner Compass is the Withdrawal Project, and the film Medicating Normal. Nicole will help us answer your questions at the end of our talk, which will be an hour long. First, we're going to see a short video about Brooke's book.
When they first put you on antidepressants, no one ever tells you to remember how to feel. Instead, they tell you that the highs will be lower and the lows will be higher. They say it will all be okay. But it wasn't okay.
You know what? It looks like a dynamite.
My father died when I was 15. Soon after, a psychiatrist diagnosed me with an anxiety and depressive disorder and put me on a cocktail of antidepressants. I stayed on those same drugs for the next 15 years.
Brooke, do you know what that clock is for?
Just before my 30th birthday, I found myself hanging halfway out my Manhattan high-rise window, contemplating the time it would take to hit the ground. And then I wondered, if the antidepressants were working, then why did I want to take my own life? And if the antidepressants weren't working, who might I be without them? For 15 years, I never believed I was capable of healing. And then I learned that it is only in the agonizing edges of ourselves that we find where our life's work lives. It is in this place where true healing begins.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you, Brooke?
I'm good. How are you, Adele?
Good. You know, you've done an incredible job with this book, and it seems as though you are interviewing everywhere. Your podcast with Psych Central was very interesting. That was just last week, right?
Yeah, it aired last week. That one was a little interesting.
Yeah, and in it, I think you displayed a very impressive knowledge of withdrawalology. So it seems like there's, this is not the usual author's tour to sell a book. What's going on here?
This book was incredibly difficult to sell. I had already published a cookbook, because I was a chef in New York and I had a bakery, and we'd published a cookbook, and my literary agent was like, "Oh, you should write a book about something else and your travels." And I kind of started to do that thinking it would be sort of easy. So I was integrated into the writers, the world of writing and the writing world. And I knew how to sell a book and what it looked like from my other experience. And then when it got to the point with this book, as I was writing it, I started to see more mainstream articles coming out in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New Yorker. And so I just had a hunch that this was going to be a topic that was going to start really coming up in the zeitgeist. And also, I wanted to write the book I wish I had. I mean, I felt so confused and alone, and oftentimes not believed in my own withdrawal journey, that I just couldn't believe that there wasn't an account of what it's like to be in withdrawal that could help prescribers and patients understand what this feels like, and, or family members, right? So there wasn't anything like that. There's memoirs on depression and bipolar and schizophrenia and alcoholism, but there was nothing on this. And I really felt that it was imperative that we have something. So I wrote this book, and then my literary agent went out to start selling it in April of 2020, which, that wasn't exactly a great time, given that, every doctor was dispensing antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs like crazy. And I thought there would be I thought it would be easier to get it sold because of that, and also just because this was coming up in the zeitgeist. But it turned out to be really difficult. We obviously found a publisher; they're great, and I think that thank God for the delay, because now the timing has been amazing. I mean, the book came out in September, and we've had monster articles in the New York Times and Newsweek. It was on the cover, and the serotonin analysis paper that came out by Mark Horowitz and Joanna Moncrief, and now I'm just really thrilled to be part of this movement. And for me, selling books is almost the byproduct of just making antidepressant withdrawal a household word, right? If antidepressants are a household thing, then withdrawal needs to be the second part of that conversation, and tapering, because that's such an important part. And so hopefully, they work together. But for me, the book is there as a supplement to the message that I'm hoping to spread.
Yeah, and I think that you had already a reputation based on your TV appearance on Chopped. So a lot of things came together that made interviewers curious to talk about you, I think.
That helps. The Chopped angle, definitely. Everyone wants to talk about that, so it's fun to
Right. Well,
lighten the mood up a little bit with an absurd cooking competition.
Yeah. But I think that, and this is something I think you've observed yourself, is that your story is something of a story of your generation, which also might include an appearance on a TV reality contest. You were only 15 when you started on antidepressants, and this was, let's see, so this was 30 something years ago. 2001, right? That was the beginning of the antidepressant era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And can you tell a little bit more about those circumstances?
Sure. My father passed away, as you saw in the video, suddenly when I was 15. It was July 3rd of 2001. And I'm an only child. It's me and my mom, and there's not really a ton of extended family. It's always been very insular. So the feeling, 3 go to 2 was a pretty obviously big shift. And I've always been a kid and a person who I want to do well by the people around me. Like, I was getting really good grades. I was a dancer. I had, there was not a bone in my body that was, going down the wrong path or hanging out with the wrong crowd, right? So that wasn't really something that I think was a realistic threat. But I do think that, grief, especially at that age, and the shock of it all, it caused me to act differently. And so my grades started slipping a little bit. I wasn't, pulling in Fs, but we went from like A's to B's. And, I was having some kind of controlled eating disorder tendencies, in part because I was a really serious dancer, in part because it was a method of control during a time of chaos. And all of that just kind of led me to a psychologist's office, child psychologist. And then she was just like not great at her job. And I'm in Reno, Nevada. I was here then, and I don't even know if there was another child psychologist in town. It was the one that came recommended. So we went. Yeah. And then she said, "Oh, I'm diagnosing an anxiety and depressive disorder, and you should see a psychiatrist." And she told my mom that. And then my mom, following the due diligence of the doctor and trying to be a good parent, went and followed the advice. And then, 1 appointment, and 20 minutes later, I had my first script. I mean, it's the story most of us have been through. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for me, I know we tried a few different medications first. I don't remember what we tried. I know that there were at least 2 before we landed on a combination of Effexor and Wellbutrin. And the reason why we switched stuff around is because I had very obvious side effects for the first 2. Like, I remember the first one, I took it for like one morning and then got so sick at school I had to come home. And I think the next one I was like falling asleep at my desk. So it was clearly not the right. It was clearly obviously not what they called the right choice. But then the combination of Wellbutrin and Effexor, you know, I could wake up in the morning. I was going to school. I was getting good grades. I went to prom. It didn't appear that there was anything amiss about what we had chosen, other than the fact that nobody ever regulated it. And I eventually, you know, a couple years later, became in charge of my own medical, I turned 18, became in charge of everything. And at that point, I had just believed that this was something I needed and that I would have been broken or unfunctional without it.
So you had been on Effexor and Wellbutrin for 15 years.
Yes.
And at the start of your book, you're just about 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd been taking those drugs for all that time.
Yep.
Plus, you were taking some other drugs, levothyroxine for hypothyroidism,
Mm-hmm.
sucralfate for bile reflux, which I take to be a digestive problem.
Yeah, it's called bile reflux disease. It's basically like acid reflux, but lower down in your GI system. So your pancreas spits up too much bile into your stomach, and it causes
Right.
It was really uncomfortable.
And there's isotretinoin
Mm-hmm.
for acne. That's also known as Accutane.
Yep.
And then 200 milligrams ibuprofen for daily headaches.
Yes.
You had headaches every day.
A vitamin for good health, right? Yeah, so all of those other drugs actually arrived within about 6 to 18 months, I think, of me being put on the antidepressants.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, no one connected the dots that quite possibly these symptoms that appeared rather suddenly were from the antidepressants themselves. Frankly, I still don't know for sure whether or not these things were connected, but I do know that once I got off all the antidepressants, I also got off all the other drugs as well. So
right. But your whatever signs of hypothyroid you had seemed to clear up.
Yeah. That one was the most baffling to me because I thought that was my grandfather had a low thyroid. So I knew there was a little bit of like a genetic component. And that's one of those things where you just hear, oh, you just take some Synthroid for the rest of your life, you'll be fine. But I was shocked to hear the blood test results on that one. And it came back completely normal. And I've been normal ever since.
Right. And, but you actually, I think in your book, you say that the isotretinoin was a fairly recent. Is that right?
Yeah, that one, I had most of my life been on some combination of something for acne. I was on tetracycline for years, which in retrospect, that's an antibiotic. In retrospect, I just kind of like sort of can't believe it. And then there was another one in there. And then in my late 20s, I was still struggling with it and went on a low dose of isotretinoin on top of everything else.
Right. So you went off the Effexor first and you had some really pretty dramatic withdrawal symptoms at that time, right?
Yeah.
What was the advice you got for going off? You had come to a crisis point where you decided that you wanted to go off, which is mentioned in the video. And so what was so what kind of advice did you get about that?
I mean, it wasn't great advice, but I think that as much as I really wish that every psychiatrist and doctor out there was caring and really could help their patients and have as much time with them as they needed, the reality is that just isn't the case. So for me, my general practitioner had been prescribing me all of my drugs, including the psychiatric drugs, for about 7 years. And then when I had this realization that I had not spent a single moment unmedicated in my adult life, and like that wasn't okay because I obviously wasn't doing well, I did what I thought I was doing the right thing, right? I went and saw a psychiatrist. That's what we always say. Go talk to your doctor, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, also that's the second part of that conversation is go talk to your doctor that's in your network, who's taking patients, who's close enough to your house. And, when I looked at that, I ended up with someone who basically someone off the internet who took my insurance. And I didn't really have any frame of reference for whether or not she would be, good, bad, or neutral. And, it was early enough that at the time, it was 2016. I know that your website existed, Adele, because I remember going on it, but there was almost no other research. I remember, I think I read like Giovanni Fava's paper because I came out in 2015. But beyond that, it was just like a wasteland out there. And so, at that point, I was on 37.5 milligrams of Effexor, and she said, "Well, one, I don't support you going off these drugs, but if you're going to do it anyway, I can't prescribe you anything lower, so just stop and come back in a month." And I was like, "Well, okay." Like, I saw my doctor, I followed my doctor's advice, so I'm going to go do that.
So you cold turkey to 37.5 milligrams. And then within 4 days, you started having some very significant adverse reactions, some very significant withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, I think I had certainly experienced times over the 15 years where, like, you forget to refill your prescription or pick it up, or you just forget about it one morning and you kind of don't realize that you've forgotten your pill until your heart starts racing or something's off and you're like, "What's happening to me? Oh, I forgot this." And then you go take it, right? So I sort of expected that. And I had that. I've had that kind of just uncomfortable agitation. My heart raced higher than normal. But for the first few days, I don't recall it being intolerable in any way. And then about 4 days in, there was a very, very specific moment that's still one of the clearest feelings I've ever had. And the only way I can describe it is like someone lifted cellophane off of me that I didn't know I was wrapped in. I was standing on Park Avenue and about 36th Street in New York City where I lived. It was around dusk. It started to rain and it was kind of like foggy. And I remember like looking at a lamppost and looking up at it. It was one of those big ones that hang over the street. And I just noticed the light bulb. And it sounds like such a small thing, but what really had occurred is that for all these years, I had noticed that there was light coming from this lamppost, but I never noticed the light bulb. And then I turned, and I remember turning, and I remember looking at the headlights of all the taxis, and I just saw them go from these like fuzzy orbs to these really clear stars. And I said, "That's weird." And then I started noticing the sounds around me like really intensely. And then the thing that really got me was the rain started hitting my arms and it hurt. It was like my skin in this moment became so sensitive that the rain actually hurt my skin. And I just stood there with my arms kind of out like this, like watching everybody around me, just experiencing this. And that was the moment when I realized, oh, these drugs have had a huge impact on me in ways I did not understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what's about to happen, but like I'm about to get on the ride. That's the way it felt.
Right. Well, it sounds like you developed hypersensitivity in a lot of different areas. You became hypersensitive to sound, and as you say, your skin became sensitive, and it also sounds like you might have had some temperature dysregulation, where you were hot
and cold. Yeah.
Did that continue? That you were, that you found that you were hot, very hot sometimes, and very cold sometimes?
I don't recall feeling specifically hot or specifically cold as much as there was just this feeling of generally being uncomfortable. And I like if I was feeling like I was having a hot flash or getting sweaty, it wasn't like the heat was my biggest problem in that moment. So it was more of like a byproduct of what was going on. So I wasn't made so uncomfortable by that, but that I felt like it was a major symptom as much as it always just came along with something else, like the rain or mood swings or whatever.
Right. It also seems as though you had some other visual disturbances where you had visions of violent occurrences all around you.
Oh yes, that was fun. So I know now that those are intrusive thoughts, and the way I describe it is it's kind of like almost a little bit like a projector screen is kind of overlaid. Like obviously if you could still see what was going on in real life, but it's like in the back of my head, it's almost like I could run through like 1,000 violent experiences that could happen in a span of a second, you know, either at my hand or somebody else.
Right.
And it was, I mean, it was just one of the most, it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. And I wouldn't have believed that something like that was possible. It was the first time I really felt like I had absolutely no control over my brain and my mind and my thoughts. I mean, it's one thing to, you know, have kind of anxious thoughts and over worry and rehearse conversations in your head that you're going to have with someone. Like on some level, that still felt like me and in control. This felt like I had been infected by something on the outside and it was running me. And that, I mean, that lasted for quite a while. I mean, at least very intensely for a few weeks. And then it's something that's sort of come and gone as the years have gone by. And, you know, even now, sometimes I still have them, but now I treat them differently. I think that they were triggered by withdrawal initially. And now it's a sign of something else. But because I experienced it in withdrawal, I'm better able to handle it.
Right. Well, people do report all kinds of, you know, kind of like unbidden or forbidden thoughts coming up with withdrawal. And we call that neuroemotions because it seems as though there's something about, you know, the neurological chaos of withdrawal combined with perhaps what you're afraid of most about yourself. So it emerges in all kinds of, you know, like weird, repetitive thoughts that, and people can feel very overcome by that. I know that when I experienced withdrawal myself, and it was pretty terrible. And as you said, you know, at any given time, I had a lot more problems than any one symptom. But for quite a while, I'd have these waves where I would relive like every embarrassing or stupid thing I'd ever done. And it was, you know, stuff that I had forgotten for years. So it seems as though there's something about it that perhaps that when you're taking the drug, it, you know, sort of clamps down your, those types of memories, and you have a natural, you know, we all have a natural self-defense or self-care mechanism where we discard bad memories, and everybody has them, and so we just, you know, say, okay, bygones. But then when you come off the drugs, that is disinhibited. And so all of those things start to circulate again. You know, fortunately for me, you know, I had waves and waves of this for quite a while, but it did go away. So you know, this is something that I see from people on my website, that it really disturbs them when this happens. And I think that one of the things that we need to say is that, you know, keep calm, get through it, because it's an outcome of whatever chaos is going on inside you, and it'll go away. So so you also now, in your, you know, there's the beginning of withdrawal is an acute withdrawal period where you tend to have very physical symptoms such as nausea, which you had as well, and then you go into a later period. But it seems as though one of the characteristics of your withdrawal syndrome was these waves of violent impulse or rage. Is that right?
Yeah, I describe it more as rage than violent impulse. Like I didn't. I think that like the term like violent impulse implies that I was out, you know, buying a semi-automatic rifle. Which was not the case. For me, it was very much an internal rage, just a level of anger that, again, I'd never experienced before. And there was a physical need to release it. I didn't have the ability to calm down and process it and release it in a very what the culture would call productive way. But from my perspective, I think that's kind of bullshit. That like, the productive way to handle anger is by stuffing it. No, I don't think that's right. I think it needed to come out. And for me, it was just a struggle to find safe ways to get that to release. And very often, because if I had a wave of rage or anger that would come up when I was in public, like say on the subway, then it was a real struggle to, fight the need to punch a pillow or punch anything or like scream as deep as I could scream
Mhm.
while I was on the subway, right? So that was, but then I'd get home and kind of let loose, and God only knew what my neighbors thought at the time, but
Well, you also had periods of very deep emotional pain, right?
Mhm.
You were like you described being curled up on your bed
Yeah.
and I guess feeling a lot of physical chaos, but also that emotional chaos. Uh, how long did that part last?
That was, I mean, I was kind of a classic windows and waves in the sense that I could have a really bad day and then be a little bit better the next, and then have an awful day and then have two okay days, and that windows and waves period for me lasted for about a year. Uh, with that kind of, I almost want to call it like a primal scream or a primal cry, just something that felt so animal in a way. And
Yeah.
that was about a year before I started to really get trust that if I had this very primal reaction or experience, that I was going to come out of it. Like it took at least a dozen or so windows and waves for me to say, okay, like I know that I'm going to come out of this. I don't know how long. I don't know how long it's going to take until the next one or if there will be a next one, but I trust that I'm going to come out. And that was a pretty big mental shift for me, knowing that I now trusted my body enough to not let this fully destroy everything. It was a passing experience. That was an important thing for me to understand.
Right. Well, but at that time, you had found a spiritual guide who had been recommended by your mother, who
Yeah.
sounds like a very, very kind, sensitive person. And he helped you get through these waves. Is that right?
Yeah. So I was in a very unique situation in that part of the impetus for getting off all these antidepressants was this opportunity to travel around the world for a year. And it was the sort of opportunity that you don't plan for. And when you get it, you take it, you don't let it go because it's never going to come again. And I knew that. And so I said, okay, not only do I have a reason to get off these drugs because I've been on them my whole adult life and I'm not doing well, but also I didn't want a suitcase full of medication. I didn't want to figure out how to get my 6 drugs prescribed reliably in the middle of, nowhere, Cambodia or Croatia. I didn't want to deal with that. And then I was also having memory problems from the years of the drugs. I'm struggling to remember things, and I didn't want to go on the trip and forget it. It was a very basic thing. So in my case, I thought I would stabilize, or that withdrawal, if it happened, would be so short that I would be fully either on no drugs at all and like happily trotting off on a one-way flight out of the country, or that I would have said, okay, well, those drugs didn't work. I would have found new ones and, all would have been right with the world. And again, I would happily get on the plane and trot off. But what actually happened was withdrawal lasted for long enough for me that about the first half of my trip, so I spent about 6 months in withdrawal in New York City. In the next 6 months, I was still in withdrawal while I was traveling. And then it started to lighten up towards the latter half of my trip. But the reason why I mention this is because I was in a very unique position of having stripped every aspect of my life that could have potentially influenced my mental state in a negative way and in a consistent way. So, I was no longer allowed to blame the fact that New York City is expensive, or my business partner that I didn't get along with, or a business that I didn't want to own and a job I didn't want to go to, and the fact that dating in New York is hard. Like none of that, which was so much a part of my narrative as to why I was unhappy, that all evaporated the second I got on the plane. And the next thing you know, my environment is changing on a weekly, sometimes monthly basis. And the only consistent was me. So it made it very clear what my issues were, as opposed to, what I might have blamed on other people or outside circumstances. And because of that, at the time I had started working with this counselor, spiritual guide, counselor, alternative therapist. There's many names you could give him, but the bottom line is he was someone who helped me work through all this stuff, and he was able to do it remotely back before, remote therapy was considered common. But it allowed me, because my issues became so salient, because it was so clear that I was the problem and that I had to fix myself, I was able to work with him in these sessions in a very, very efficient way, because we didn't spend any time, talking about my business partner, because that wasn't a problem anymore. So, and I really, really appreciated his style and his technique, because I think that, for people who've been on these drugs a long time, there's such a disconnection between your emotions and who you really are. And I struggled so much in traditional therapy when they would say things like, well, take me back to the first time you felt this way as a child, or tell me about your father, or, they would trace everything back to my father's death. And I couldn't connect to a lot of that stuff, because I was in shock when he died. Pretty much the year before and the few years after are almost completely wiped from my memory in a way that, like, I think it's irrecoverable. So I actually cannot connect to the grief or the feeling of losing him. So therefore, I can't work through that pain. What I can connect to is what's happening in my life now and the emotion that's coming up. And so working with Alan, that was his name, I was able to say, like, okay, I'm on the bed, in these kind of like primal cries or primal screams, and what I'm feeling inside of me is this like idea of being abandoned by my tribe, right? It sounds bizarre, but if that's the image that was coming into me, he allowed me to work with that, and there wasn't any judgment. It wasn't about what happened in the past, or a very three-dimensional world. It was about the world I lived in and the world I created, and the metaphors that allowed me to explain this. And I think that was really important for me, and that's part of what helped in my healing.
I think that is really important, because I want to note that Alan was helping you while you were in withdrawal.
Yes.
This is,
I was totally off all the drugs.
Right. Alan came to you, or you came to Alan while you were in the midst of withdrawal. And so you were having what we'd call neuroemotions. And he seemed to be a specialist in self-forgiveness.
Yes.
Which is so important when people are having these emotional spells in withdrawal, because you don't really know where they're coming from. It's just an overwhelming feeling. And conventional psychotherapy will try to find historical connections, but they might not even be there. And so, but learning how to forgive yourself in the moment, I think, is an incredible skill to have. I know that I kind of, arrived at it myself because I didn't have any other choice. I didn't have unfortunately, any spiritual guidance at the time, but I just had to learn how to say, I forgive myself over and over again every day, practically, sometimes I'd have to do it every minute. You'd have to because you cannot bring that type of guilt and self-blame into this neurological chaos. It'll just make you suffer more. So it also seems that when you were at this crisis point in your life, for all the reasons that you mentioned, your problems with your business, you're living in New York, it's, you're maybe in the wrong place, in the wrong job at the wrong time. And, you kind of decided that you're going to cut all your strings, and you applied to Chopped, and you applied to to this year abroad in a kind of like a spontaneous like I'm a gesture of like, I'm going to get out of here. So, or I'm going to just do stuff that's new. And so you were both, as you say, hanging out the window, thinking that you might want to kill yourself. And you were also thinking, I'm just going to get out of this life and do something else. So you were going in both directions at once.
Well, sort of. I mean, I applied to all these moonshots, right? Like, I applied to Chopped. I applied to be a chef at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. I applied to be a goat sitter in the Alps. I applied to all these things. This all happened while I was still on the antidepressants, including jobs. But for me, it was more of like, I think it was so painful to be home. And by that, I mean like home within myself and the life I had created, that I spent a lot of time in another life that I wanted to create, but not so much that I was really going to like actually make the moves to go be a goat sitter, because I applied to these ridiculous things that either, so many people were applying for that there was no chance I was going to get chosen, or things that were just so fundamentally impossible. But I think that like in retrospect, and this is so much of what I've learned through withdrawal, and I would love to talk about the idea of withdrawal as a teacher, because I do think that it has taught me the greatest lessons of my life. But in retrospect, it's so funny to me and so obvious that if I was spending my time applying to these moonshots, these desperate almost cries for help to get out of the life I was in, I somehow couldn't take the smaller, more reasonable steps to just say, okay, maybe I'm going to leave my business. Maybe I'll move to another city, right? Like those seem smaller and more reasonable because they're more practical and people do it all the time. But the difference is that I had put so many steps between myself and like all these fantastical moonshots were so unlikely that it was easy to, it was easy to apply for them because the likelihood was low. But the actual actions really laid everything out. I was unhappy and I was in a situation that was wrong for me. What I couldn't, so stuck in my own muck though, that I could not fathom how someone got out of there. And, everything was such a sunk cost, right? I'd spent so much time. Well, was it going to be all for nothing? And like, the answer's no. I mean, nothing's ever for nothing, but also great. My life's so much better when I got out of that situation. So like, why wouldn't I have just done it sooner? But I think these are the things that you kind of almost have to learn in withdrawal if you're really paying attention, because it really forces you to go inside and say, okay, like, what does my body want and need? And when do I feel good? And when do I feel bad? And it really helps hone your compass if you let it. It's just that it's so painful to do that. And it's so out of your control that our instinct is to fight it because it feels like there's such a threat. We feel, maybe at points like we are literally going to succumb from this. And that is so terrifying that we put up all our boundaries and go lock ourselves in our room and go to bed. When maybe what it's asking us to do is evaluate our life and the situations we're in and the people we spend our time with. And maybe it's telling us to start pivoting and taking a different direction, even though we don't know what that means.
Right. Well, withdrawal forces you into a type of radical self-care.
Mm-hmm.
You have to sometimes get really down to basics, like, have some sleep discipline, have some diet discipline, feed yourself good food, go to sleep at a reasonable time every day, avoid stress and that kind of thing, which are, perhaps ways that we should have always been taking care of ourselves. But we get pushed to the brink in withdrawal. So then we really have to learn how to do that. Another thing
about what works for you too. Like, sorry to interrupt, but it's just, you can have two people who are on the same drug for the same amount of time, who are having the same withdrawal symptoms, who have different ways of mitigating those. And because this is such unknown territory and we don't really know the reasons why some people react the way they do, it's unfortunately an existence of experimentation and tenacity and kind of radical acceptance for what is happening at the moment, even when it's uncomfortable. And that's a really difficult thing to do, because it's kind of the one thing that no one can help you with, right?
Right.
Like, no doctor, they can have done all the research in the world and read everything. They can't tell you at the end of the day what's going to maybe alleviate some of this stuff until you start trying it. And so, again, that's where the inner compass really comes in, and the intuition of what, I'm going to try this. I'm curious about it. I think it might help, as opposed to something that really doesn't feel good, but maybe it worked for 1,000 other people, so you get confused, right?
Well, people should definitely not persist in stuff that doesn't feel good. That's
It's a hard thing to learn and practically.
it is, it's a really hard thing to learn.
Not feeling good, and you're like, is this the withdrawal? Am I actually still depressed? Is it something else? Like, it's such a tangled ball of yarn.
Right,
So
right. Right, and also the unpredictability. People become very scared that
Yeah.
they can't tell what's going to happen next. You know, you have a window and you think, "Oh, I'm doing so much better now." And then you have a wave and people often think, "Oh, this is going to be forever." But then as you say, you experience this and you realize that you have to accept the bad parts. You have to accept the bumps, and then you'll eventually get to another clear space. The acceptance is really another it is another mode of self-care, because you're not fighting against your reality. You have to you accept your reality and you recognize it, and then you take care of yourself for where you are at the moment, and not where you expected to be, or not where your family expected you to be, or any place else. So I think that that's a really important thing for people to understand, that when they are experiencing withdrawal, you're experiencing withdrawal. It's not your failure. It is withdrawal symptoms, and you'll have to, let them pass. It's kind of like a meditation type of thing, where you're like, have to let the clouds pass in the sky, and to get to the next place where it's not so bad. One of the things that I think is really striking is that here you are in the midst of withdrawal, and you get the notice that you're going to be on Chopped, which ordinarily, under any conditions, would have sent me into a tremendous panic. And and you are, quite agitated by withdrawal, as well as everything else that's going on in your life. But you manage to make the arrangements. You start drilling, studying recipes and such, studying technique, so that you can participate on Chopped. So you manage to get yourself together to the extent that you can prepare for a TV appearance. And I think that that's pretty amazing, because when I was in withdrawal, my ability to concentrate was so fragmented that I had to coach myself through doing things like washing my face. It'd have to be like, okay, go to the bathroom, turn on the tap, put some water on your face. I'd have to give myself instructions like that. So I can't imagine how you manage to look at that basket of food ingredients on Chopped and actually figure out what to do with them.
I had a really fascinating conversation with someone yesterday who's been through, just a pretty horrific withdrawal story, and he was talking about how he suffers from akathisia, and how he uses it as a tool. And he's not trying to make light or positive the situation. Like, obviously, she wishes he didn't have it, but he's literally transformed the literal energy in his body into something physical. And I think that is a probably easier to understand explanation, because of the physical to physical of kind of what I did with Chopped. I mean, for me, there was such a internal there was just general panic pretty much all the time about everything, whether or not it was it was dangerous for me to travel around the world or leave New York, or what was I going to do with my dog, or how was I going to make money? I mean, there was just kind of this overwhelming level of worry and panic and anxiety that came on very suddenly for me in withdrawal. And so what I did is I channeled all of that into preparing for Chopped, because I also wasn't sleeping very well. So I'd sit there at night and I would make flashcards. So I had this stack of flashcards of, time and temperatures for certain meats, or, what certain vegetables or fruits are that I didn't know. I mean, that's how I kind of took all of the frenetic energy from withdrawal. when I wasn't exhausted, because that happened too. I think I got lucky on the actual CHOP day. I mean, at that point I was just so worked up about it, and I worked a lot with my counselor Alan with it as well.
Mhm.
That, you know, I think I had a little bit of a window on the day I filmed Chopped, but you know, and that's just, I just used it a little bit more as a tool. And, you know, that's the way that I was able to use it. I know not everyone feels that they're in their place for withdrawal to be able to do that. But for me, just the sheer anxiety and panic over everything, and the time. I had so much time all of a sudden, so I wasn't sleeping. So I just made a lot of flashcards and, you know, burned pots of onions at 3 a.m. And,
Yeah.
you know, it paid off. I won. That was great. But I would have preferred to have gone through that process with a little bit more lightness and levity and laughter. That would have been great.
Do you think that you might have been a little hypomanic at the time?
You know, I don't know. I hesitate to put a word on it like that, because I think it would have been really easy for me to get, you know, garner a bipolar diagnosis had I talked to a psychiatrist about it at the time. I think in reality, it's just like, look, my body was just thrown into such a bizarre, frenetic state because I had suddenly pulled away all these really powerful drugs, and it didn't know how to react. And it just took, I mean, I think we just overcorrected. You know, it kind of is what withdrawal is the sudden overcorrection that you then have to find your normal. So, I mean, I never had experienced something like that in my life beforehand, and haven't since, and you know, at least in sort of like a long-term way. But I wasn't, you know, I wasn't paranoid. Well, actually, no, I was a little paranoid, but not in like a Beautiful Mind. There's, you know, strings and on the wall kind of way. It was more general paranoia. Like,
yeah.
I got
yeah. Well, when I was in acute withdrawal, which was about the first 6 weeks of going off of Paxil, I was definitely hypomanic, and I did some really amazing things that I otherwise would not have done. And one of the among them was, you know, I became really uncharacteristically outgoing and very talkative and very focused. And I was having a great time, but I was also sweating a lot and not sleeping very much. And I also drank a huge amount of scotch one night, and that ordinarily I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't do that. But that did eventually fade after 6 weeks, and I became, I got more conventional withdrawal with waves and windows, where I felt absolutely miserable and incapable of anything. So, you know, I have to ask, because I have, there are periods where I watch CHOP, and I think I watched it for part of my recovery from withdrawal, because it's fun, but there are no loud noises.
Right.
And I remember one of the episodes, somebody got one of the ingredients were these chocolate gummy worms, which sound, you know, absolutely disgusting on their own. Was that in your basket?
No, I mean, I didn't have chocolate gummy worms in my basket. It was a chocolate themed episode. So it's if anyone out there is like dying to watch it, it's on Hulu, season 32, episode 6, Chocolate Obsession. Yeah, I was really lucky. I was very worried after we filmed that day that they were going to edit me into a complete mess of a person, because they could have. It was not my most graceful day. I was often very emotional and crying and panicky. And I thank the editors every time someone talks to me about CHOP that they chose to make me look like a
Well, I probably have seen people cry before.
No, going through antidepressant withdrawal at the time. They didn't have to do that, but they did.
Yeah. So shortly after that, then you were on your way to Asia.
Yeah.
And again, you know, I don't know if I would have been even able to make all of those arrangements. You had to do a tremendous amount of logistical arrangements. you had to, and not even, even buying plane tickets probably would have been beyond me. But you did manage to do that. And by that time, how many months were you into withdrawal? Was that about 6 months?
It was about 6 from the Effexor. It was about 6 from the Effexor, and like 4 or 5, I can't quite remember, from the Wellbutrin, and then I had been coming off of all the other, the Synthroid and everything else too.
Yeah.
And I one of my great tendencies in life, and this was sort of the case, this has been the case my whole life, so it's not withdrawal specific, is that it looks like on the outside that I make very, very big rash decisions, because like one day I'm just like, I'm going on this trip around the world. It's happening. I've already paid the deposit and bought a ticket. And everyone's like, what? It seems very, very, very sudden, but I've really been thinking about it a long, long time, and, working with the logistics. And it's just, by the time I announce it, it just seems sudden. But for me, I think I paid for this trip around the world, like the deposit. I did that before I stopped taking the Effexor. It was like I went and saw the psychiatrist, came home, sat there for a little bit, thought about it, paid for this deposit, and then stopped taking my Effexor, because I like to get myself into situations where I can't wiggle my way out of it, because that's how I know I do stuff. And so for me, like, yeah, all the logistics about, visas and packing and moving and all that stuff, it was a lot. And I think that, you think from the outside that you wouldn't be capable of doing something like that. But when you have no choice, it's amazing what we're able to do. And again, I think that's what's unique about my story, where it isn't with a lot of other people, is that, I guess I could have had the choice not to go, but that didn't really seem like a choice at all after, I left my business, and I rehomed my dog, and I had someone take over my lease, and I had a plane ticket. Like, for me, it was either I get on this plane come hell or high water, or I go live in my mom's basement, and I wasn't willing to do that. So I think, like, I did all, it's kind of similar to grief. Like, there's this show called Dead to Me, and the woman, she's grieving, and she's like on the toilet sobbing, and I was watching that just like, yeah, that's right, like, you're still going about your day-to-day activities, like, you have to go to the toilet, but you might be sobbing while you're doing it. And to me, that's how withdrawal felt, is like, yes, I was still doing a lot, and doing a lot of big things. I wasn't handling it as well as I would have had I not been going through withdrawal. And it was often very ugly, in the sense that there were tear marks all over my visa applications, but I didn't know how else to do it. So that's kind of, again, why I think my situation's a little different, is because I had to do these things. And when you have to, you were
Right.
so
Yeah,
strong.
you weren't able to turn back.
Mhm.
You'd gotten yourself into a situation that you couldn't turn back.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you were off to Asia, but by that time you were having waves and windows of withdrawal. So there were periods where you were just a mess, and some periods where you were somewhat less of a mess.
Yeah.
And then when you were in Asia, you had to, in a way, your life was simplified, because you had to get by day to day.
Mhm.
And it actually,
Everything was new. I didn't speak the language.
just deal with your environment,
Yeah.
find out where to find food,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And it seems as though your waves and windows, your symptom pattern might have changed. Was it different from? I guess there was a lot more going on when you were in New York, but then when you finally got to Asia, what were you feeling in terms of your withdrawal symptoms?
A lot of it was the same, but it had just become so commonplace that I, on some level, was sort of used to it. Like, and also, when we're talking about the book, like, I have to tell a story there, right? So if I keep, harping on the same issues 200 pages in that I harped on in the first 20 pages, right? Like, that's not a story people want to read. But a lot of this stuff, like the noise sensitivity is a prime example. Like, that that is the thing
Yeah.
that has taken me the longest to kind of recover from.
Mhm.
And it was just as bad while I was traveling as it was while I was in New York. But there were other things going on in Asia too. So I was able to, I might mention the noise sensitivity, but there was a lot of positive things happening and a lot of kind of awakening, if you will, that
Right.
I also consider to be part of withdrawal. And I think that's really important, is we really like to talk about all the negative aspects of withdrawal because they're painful and they're uncomfortable and they hurt us. But it is two things, right? There's almost like at least in my case, and what I've heard from people is there's this almost awakening that comes with withdrawal as well, of who you really are and like what you actually want in your life. And so for me, I was, I didn't have really any creative urges while I was on antidepressants at all. Like absolutely none. And then I start to get off these drugs and all of a sudden I have this like insatiable urge to paint something. And I'm like, I've never painted. I don't know how to paint. And so I went out and bought some cheap brushes and I started to paint watercolors, at night. And I was so struck by that because it was just such a part of me that I didn't know that existed. I couldn't figure out why I wanted to do that. And, the reality is that I am a very creative person and I'm an artist and I like to make things. And that was part of my withdrawal process, was realizing that and then using that. And so that is kind of the case, I think, for the whole thing. And, so for me in Asia, because a lot of my withdrawal symptoms, like the noise sensitivity or the intrusive thoughts or the rage or, whatever, it was then starting to be layered in with these moments of feeling like myself that I hadn't felt ever as an adult. And so I was able to be so curious about those things, like, what music do I like to listen to? What food do I like to eat? All these little things that was just me getting to know myself. And that is as much a part of the withdrawal process as the physical symptoms, the bad physical symptoms we have. And I would hope that people can learn to better explore that side of it, because that's what's underneath all this. And so when I was in Asia, I started to really get to explore that, and that's only grown. And now it's, manifested into a life that's good for me because of all the things I learned during that time.
Well, it seems as though when you were going through Thailand, which was about 8 months after you went off of Effexor, I think, that you started to think of yourself as somebody other than a psychiatric patient.
Mm-hmm.
And you were finding out so many other parts of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak more to that?
Sure. I don't think I ever really thought of myself as a psychiatric patient, because I actually spent shockingly little time in psychiatric offices, which is possibly part of the problem, right? I mean, I probably had less than 6 hours of psychiatric appointments in my whole life of being on these drugs. But I did think of myself as very much a broken person, in the sense that I thought that, the depression and the anxiety was who I was. And so the reframing in Thailand was very much like, and then that kind of transitions into withdrawal, right? Then you're not just a broken person because of depression and anxiety. You're broken because you're in withdrawal. So withdrawal is your identity. But it was in Thailand, I think, where I started to be able to realize, okay, like, if I let withdrawal take over my identity, it will become my identity, and I'm not really going to be any better off. So we need to start figuring out what's underneath this. And that's where the radical acceptance of however withdrawal lasts, that's as long as it's going to be for me. But when I was able to start feeling these moments of joy or peace or connection with the earth, then that's when I started to feel like there is more to me than withdrawal, than depression and these pills. And that was kind of that was kind of the gateway for me to really open and start healing.
Yeah. And now your life, it's 6 years later, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your life is very different. Where are you now?
I'm back in my hometown of Reno, Nevada. Kind of accidentally moved back during the pandemic, like so many people do. And, I still make money through cooking. I take private clients and I do consulting for startups. So like this morning I made cookies as part of my job. It's pretty great. And then I have my book and I speak as much as I can, and I'm hoping to really move into the world of public speaking as much as possible. in the next couple of years. And yeah, just, you know, I mean, if you're going to go through all that work of withdrawal, you may as well enjoy what's on the other side. So just try
And
to do
how's your health? Your thyroid cleared up? How about your digestive problems?
So the thyroid is totally cleared up. The digestive problems have been the one just honestly bitch of the thing that I've continued to deal with. I feel like I'm finally getting somewhere in the past couple of years after really starting to stand up for myself and, you know, not accept just the, you know, guess you can't have gluten things. Like I knew there was something else going on. So
Not gluten.
yeah.
Oh no.
Well, I mean, like what I've discovered is, I mean, I think that these drugs they just do a huge number on your gut biome, right? And so I've started to work with someone to help build that stuff back. I mean, honestly, the biggest thing that's made a difference for me in my day-to-day gut life is having a couple bites of kimchi before every meal. Like more than any doctor I've been to, that has made the biggest difference, right? And just like replenishing a lot of that really good gut bacteria. So I had
solution
going on too, but you know, sometimes the solutions aren't that complicated, right? And like kimchi's not going to hurt you. So, you know, go to your local Asian market, buy a quart of it and just eat a couple bites.
It's delicious.
Yeah.
And how about the headaches? Have they gone away?
For the most part, the headaches are completely gone. I get like a lot of my aches and pains, back aches and stuff are all away. I mean, the more I healed my brain, the more my body healed too.
Yeah.
And I think that's, again, something we really tend to forget. So heal the mind, heal the self.
Yeah. That's wonderful. We're about to take some questions. Brooke, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I'm excited to see the questions. I haven't been paying attention to the chat at all.
Okay,
so.
we have questions.
Thank you everyone for coming on this 11 o'clock or 2 o'clock, wherever you are.
Okay, we have one from Philomena. In one of her writings, Brooke mentioned a very harsh withdrawal symptom, violent, intrusive thoughts. Would she be willing to tell us about how she dealt with this particular symptom, this fear of losing control, while traveling as well? I was always also struck with a phrase that you tended to use, which was losing my edges. And I was wondering if you might speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as far as the edges things go, I mean, I feel like the best way to describe it is that when I'm clear, and when I was clear in withdrawal, I very much felt like I was just aware of myself in both a physical and kind of a spiritual cognitive way. And then when things started to go awry, either through the violent intrusive thoughts or, you know, just a wave, it felt almost like my edges became porous and I was accepting all of these things that were coming in and I couldn't control it. And I almost it felt like I lost my agency, but it could happen in a moment. So it was a little odd. And I think that like the process of withdrawal and recovery has been finding my edges and understanding where they are. It makes more sense in the book because it's a consistent theme. But as far as how I've dealt with the violent intrusive thoughts, I mean, honestly, the very first thing I did that made any difference at all was actually being honest to someone else and saying out loud what exactly I was seeing and feeling, because I had so much shame built up around, like, I mean, I'll just tell y'all because we're all, you know, we're all open here. Like, I had a dog that I loved to death, and if I was carrying like a pair of scissors, I would have an intrusive thought of stabbing the dog with the scissors, right? Like, that is something like that breaks my heart to even think about now, that my mind was capable of going there, followed by, oh my God, what if I actually did this? And then the terror, right? And that's when I thought, like, I'm actually crazy here. Like, this is something I hadn't dealt with. But what I've realized now in working with Alan, like, I started to tell him these things, and even just being able to talk about it out loud really took the edge off. Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously you have to tell this to a trusted person, because I would not have told it to my psychiatrist, because I think she would have put me on an involuntary psychiatric hold, because she would have thought I was a threat to myself or somebody else if I'm saying this stuff, right? So I was lucky that I had someone. And, you know, if you don't feel like you have someone, maybe even just writing it down or saying it out loud to yourself, you know, maybe in the shower is a way to kind of get it out. And then the next thing I started to do when I wasn't working directly with Alan about these things, and this is something that's become relevant, is well, first, meditation has been a really good thing for me. I specifically really like metta meditation, or loving kindness meditation, which is where you send love and gratitude out towards other people and ultimately turn it back on yourself. I think that what that does is it's almost just it's fighting the darkness with the light, right? If you have such a dark, awful thought that comes in, then by engaging in something that is just pure love, it's the best way, I think, to be able to counter that. And doing that over time, every single morning. The first day it didn't make much of a difference, but it's the cumulative effect over time, over months or weeks, that starts to make the difference there. And then the last thing too is, like I've said, I think so much about this is doing the work within yourself. And so, I ask myself, like, why is this coming up? What does this have to tell me? What is the message here? If you can look at it as a message, not that there's something that you're scared of losing, or in my case, like, it's this fear of, I love this dog so much. If something happens to her, and what if it's my fault and it's an accident, and like just the salience of how life can change at any moment, that really, really has come up a lot for me and brought some fear. And then that's something I could then take to my counselor and work with him on.
It seemed as though Alan would listen to this and he would hear your underlying pain. And so he would say, I'm sorry you were abandoned. And that to me was just, it's so loving to do that. That was really very, very beautiful, that he, I guess, has an innate talent.
Yeah.
And this is,
it's all technique. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, I learned some self-care from that, from reading your book about how Alan responded to you. And I think that if we can say that to ourselves, and which you did, that's sort of how you processed the experiences, that you heard what Alan was saying, and then you experienced your feelings coming out of that. And I think that really was a lovely gift from your book. Thank you, Brooke. We have a question from Lucy. Being on TV and withdrawal, I just can't imagine. You touched on this already, but did you ever feel scared someone would notice you aren't okay, or think you're crazy? This was one of my big fears in withdrawal.
Yeah. I didn't really feel like that too much, in part for two reasons. One, at the time, a lot of my life is pretty solitary, just naturally. Like, I often work alone. I wasn't living with a partner. Like, I didn't have to show up to an office every day. So I naturally was able to insulate myself and be very selective about who I was kind of presenting myself to. Later on, though, when I started traveling, I was with a group of about 50 strangers, and we were all traveling together. And I was very nervous about that. And my only solution was, at the time, I just kind of distanced myself, which, again, I'm not sure that was the right call, because I ended up alienating myself from a lot of these people. And it wasn't until the last month of our trip that I opened up about what I'd been going through. And that's when I finally felt the love and connection that from this group that I had really wanted the whole time. So, I think there's value in sharing what's going on with you around the people you're with, because, in some ways it gives you a little bit more, it gives everyone a little bit more forgiveness if you're having a bad day, both for how you treat yourself and, how you treat others. I mean, it's not an excuse to be an asshole, but it does help explain some things to people.
We have another question. This is a good one from Trick Shot Dave. I would be intrigued in knowing if Brooke or Adele still have sensitivities to some substances, and if it did not decrease in hypersensitivity, and did not the decrease in hypersensitivity align with their symptomatic improvement? Well, this is a good question for people who have had withdrawal over a long period of time, because I definitely felt that my hypersensitivities have decreased. Of course, I went off of Paxil in 2004, in late 2004, so it's been quite a few years. Brooke, how have you, how you felt with your hypersensitivities? You still have sound sensitivity, is that right?
Sound is still my worst one. I mean, I'm a lot better, and I'm also much more able to deal with it. Like there's earplugs in every room of my house, so that helps. I have not really had, well, just thinking now, I think that at least for me, I've not cycled around on really any prescription medications since this experience. I did have to take an antibiotic briefly because I had a cut in my finger that got infected. But other than that, I have not been on a single prescription drug since I got off of all these drugs. So from that standpoint, I actually don't know how my system would handle a lot of this stuff. I do know I'd be wary if that came up. But I do find that I am pretty sensitive to foods. There was a long period of time where I couldn't drink coffee because my system would just like freak out. And then sound, sometimes like energies of people. I mean, those are just all things where I've just, what I've realized is that like, I'm a sensitive person. And my mom has said that I was sensitive as a kid. So I think that it's just me. And there's a lot of great things about that. And so I just work with it. I've just tried not to stop it anymore. I think that has done me more harm long term. So I'm just like, all right, well, you're sensitive to noise, so move to a quiet place and buy some earplugs. Like, great. Problem solved.
Are you able to drink coffee now?
I do. I can't do it every day. It really more affects all my gut stuff than anything. But I can have a latte on the weekend now, and mostly I drink tea though.
Yeah, I think some people are sensitive to the caffeine, and it'll make them feel anxious. Chrissy has a question. Any tips for coping for us that have gone through a loss or death in their life while going through withdrawal?
Yeah. So I mean, the first one is, I just think that to the extent that you can get yourself some sort of outside support, that's someone, whether or not, that's a counselor, pastor, I wouldn't put it too much on your friends and family. Like, I think a third party is really good. I don't think it has to be like crazy therapy. I just think it needs to be someone who, supports you one way or the other in a way that works for you. But in a more kind of practical answer is that I think we very often want to view withdrawal as this outside thing that's happening to us that is separate, right? When I think what is happening, and at least what happened with me, is that it's very much a part of all experiences all at once. So one of the reasons why I think I was so successful in healing, especially with the modality I was working with, is because when I went into a session, I didn't look at withdrawal as this is something that has happened to me because I stopped taking this drug. I looked at it as the issue I needed to work on today. So if I was having if I was experiencing a lot of rage, for example, it wasn't like, oh, the rage is part of the withdrawal, it'll pass. What else is going on? Do we need to talk about your dead dad? I was like, no, we're going to talk about the rage because everything else is wrapped up in it. So I would say, like, if you're experiencing this intense loss and grief while also being in withdrawal, well, withdrawal itself brings up so much grief, so much loss, right? Like, I spent years mourning this person who had spent so long unhappy in the life I had lived and the life I had lost. I basically don't remember my 20s. That still pisses me off and makes me incredibly sad. I had to mourn the loss of that. So I think just understanding that nothing's separate and they're all feeding into one another, then whatever's coming up for you that day is what you're working on. And it's irrelevant whether or not it's a withdrawal thing or if it's a grief thing, because it's all the same.
I think that you bring up a point about the lost years, and many people do feel a great deal of grief over that period of time that they either spent on antidepressants and not really felt their full range of emotions, um, or the time that they are in withdrawal and also limited in what they can do. Um, how did you get, how did you experience getting through that?
I'm sorry, so can you reframe the first question again?
Yeah, how did, in terms of grieving the lost years,
Right.
what was your inner experience in getting through that?
Well, the first thing is like I just had to recognize that it was a real thing.
Mhm.
That part of why I was so angry and like had all this rage, like yes, of course the withdrawal was kind of creating the chemical exacerbation here, but it was for real reasons. And so I just had to acknowledge it and understand. I think learning a little bit more about grief and how grief works is was really helpful for me because grief is a compounding thing. So if you've had multiple losses, then when you lose someone new, you're not just grieving the loss of that new person, but it's, the three other people or the three other experiences or pets or jobs or houses or whatever it was that came before.
Mhm.
Right. And so to understand that, like, these overreactions, as we like to often call it, I mean, like, I think is just it's not actually it may seem like an overreaction to, be mourning the loss of your 20s or a year or whatever. People may think that an extreme expression of grief is an overreaction, but it's not necessarily that. It's compounding everything that has happened and everything that has been lost and everything you lost. So, and it all feels the same. It all feels the same to me. It's all the grief I felt over losing my father is really not that different in some ways than the grief over the ending of a long-term relationship or moving or losing a job. Like there's degrees of it, and there's intensities of it, but the feeling of being out of control is about the same. So for me, it was just a matter of acknowledging it.
Mhm.
And if I was going to be a blubbering mess that day because of something that seemed silly, well, that's just the way it was going to be, because grief doesn't make sense, and you lose your senses because you see a little curly cue of hair stuck in a brush in a drawer of the person you loved. Like that's what sets you off with grief, right? And so just to understand that is the same process for mourning like your 20s or an experience. It's just the forgiveness, it's the acceptance of it all.
Right. Jessica would like to know if Alan is open to helping others
Mhm.
like herself. I am an RSW psychotherapist in private practice on SSRIs for 24 years.
I don't know what RSW is. Do you know it all? Yeah.
No, I don't.
It's kind of irrelevant. I'm happy to provide the resources that I have if you want to email me separately after this. That there are other counselors who do this, and yeah. So
Vivek would like to know, at what point in life did you realize for sure that your withdrawal symptoms are completely gone?
It wasn't a remarkable moment, and I can't even remember a specific time. It was more of just, honestly, it was more just like realizing that I had other problems in my life that were taking up far more of my time than withdrawal ever was. It was just kind of like this, okay, I guess we sort of transitioned out of that moment. And that's not to say that there aren't still lingering things that I've had to deal with that have been more like long-term consequences of withdrawal, like the gut issues, for example. But like, I don't consider that. I'm not still having withdrawal symptoms because I'm dealing with the consequences of the gut issues. But yeah, it's just, it's when it just like wasn't on the top of my mind anymore. It's when I didn't have to seek out validation that I was, still experiencing this. It's when I was able to just really focus my life on other things and do that without trying. It just happened.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I decided to draw the line for my withdrawal, was when it was really a very minor factor in everything else that was going on with me. But I have to say that the physical symptoms have continued to get better since
Yeah.
that point. So it does continue for quite a while. The recovery does continue for a long time. Gail would like to know, question for Brooke and Adele. I have slowly reduced escitalopram to 5 milligrams, which doctors say is subclinical, but I get crazy anxiety and anger when I go below 5 milligrams. Should I stop taking the 5 and ride out the wave? How long will it last? Gail, 5 milligrams of escitalopram is not it's not an extremely low dose. In some countries, 10 milligrams of escitalopram is the maximum dose. If you're in the United States, quite frequently the dosage is much higher. Escitalopram is about 2 to 3 times stronger than citalopram, so it is a strong antidepressant. And if you go off if you're having problems at having reduced to 5 milligrams, if you quit here at 5 milligrams, you're going to get worse problems because you'll be piling withdrawal on top of withdrawal. So if I were you, I would request liquid escitalopram from your doctor. This is available by prescription if you're in the United States. And you can reduce it using the drops from the liquid escitalopram very gradually. I would not, I'm by the way, I'm just a peer counselor. I'm not giving medical advice at all. But you can, of course, consult with your doctor about very gradually reducing from 5 milligrams using the liquid. Elizabeth, what helped best with your insomnia? How did you not go into psychosis?
My insomnia wasn't so bad that I wasn't like up for days and days at a time. I just went from, I was also, I had the reverse problem when I was on medications. I could sleep for like 12 hours a night and then take a 3-hour nap. So for me, it was just like, if I was suddenly getting 5 hours a night, that was a totally different world than before. So I was getting enough to stave that away. So
yeah, I had problems with insomnia that were pretty bad. And in fact, we can persist for quite a while without developing psychosis from insomnia. If you are finding that you're getting psychotic from insomnia, if you have psychotic symptoms, it doesn't mean that you have a psychotic disease. What it means is that you're having withdrawal symptoms. And you might go back on a tiny, tiny little bit of that drug again. That's called reinstatement. If you're taking 5 milligrams, you might go back on 1 milligram because you don't want to get hospitalized mistakenly for psychosis when you're having withdrawal symptoms. And again, that's my suggestion as a peer advisor, and that's not medical advice. Nice. What were your anxiety and depression symptoms during withdrawal? Any more suicidal ideation?
My anxiety and depressive symptoms during withdrawal, I don't really feel like they were all that different from when I was on the antidepressants. I was definitely more anxious than when I was on the antidepressants. Depression was more or less the same at that point. It was just such a staple in my life that I just kind of thought that that's how it would be. But again, like I said earlier, I felt like I had a lot bigger problems than anxiety and depression during withdrawal. As far as suicidal ideation goes, it's not, it was something that had become familiar at that point. So if and when it continued during withdrawal, it didn't really feel like a stronger pull for me than it did before. It was just kind of something in my awareness that, it was just in my awareness. I would almost say there was like a reversal in that in withdrawal, I started to feel like I wanted to live, which is different than I had felt before. Like I actually wanted a future and wanted to experience what my life could be. And that to me was far more interesting than the fact that I, had passing thoughts of suicidal ideation or depression or anxiety, because that's what was new. It was this actual feeling of occasionally wanting to like see what was out there, you know, feeling curious.
Okay, trick shot. Dave wants to tell you that, Brooke, you're an amazing storyteller and you're an amazing inspiration for all of us going through this hell on earth. Can't wait to read your book.
Well, thank you. I hope y'all read it and get it and give it to your doctors, for God's sakes, and everyone in your family, and leave some reviews on Amazon and Goodreads, whatever you can do.
Oh, here's a wonderful comment to close our discussion here. Jessica wants to tell you that this is the most important talk of my life. I'm inspired to restart my discontinuation journey, but in the meantime, I'm building a support system.
Oh,
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you for everyone who has stayed with us through this discussion. It's been really wonderful to talk with you, Brooke, and good luck in your continuing journey.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Adele, and Nicole out there.
And Nicole, thank you, Nicole, for handling those comments.